Welcome to the A&E Oversight Training. This is brought to you by the Office of Guidance and Oversight within the Headquarters Division of Local Assistance. All questions, please use the chat box, and also on the side of your screen, please include panelists and attendees. So when you go to your pull-down menu, please select panelists and attendees so we can actually see all of your questions. Questions will be answered at the end. We will compile them all. We will send them in writing after the fact because we want to make sure that we answer all questions. We have 300 people who have registered for this webinar, so we want to make sure that we answer everything. We will send out the answers to not only the participants in this webinar, but also any participants that took the in-person training. Little technical difficulty here getting my slide to progress. Bear with me. Can I use the keyboard? Okay, I'm back. We're ready to roll now. Welcome to the A&E Oversight Training 2019. If you have a corrective action plan through audits and investigation, this training will suffice for meeting that requirement. This training will be posted later, also on our website for you to view. If you get an audit later or you have a corrective action plan through the district and you need to take this training, that will also suffice. You can do that at a later time. Within Caltrans Local Assistance, we have Ray Zhang as our Division Chief. Mark Samuelson is our Assistant Division Chief. Our office is through the Office of Guidance and Oversight. Kamal Saw is our current office chief. My name is Felicia Haslam. I'm the Program Manager of the A&E Oversight Branch. With me today in bulk, we have John Yang, who will be presenting later, Tay Pham, Trina Luo, who will be presenting later, Dordane Islamia, and Carol Green, who also will be joining us in giving a presentation later. Our role. Within the Office of Guidance and Oversight and the A&E Oversight Branch, we have distinct roles. Our role is that we provide guidance and oversight for the agencies. We have two main documents that we use to provide that guidance and oversight. For the guidance portion, we have the Local Assistance Procedure Manual that is updated once a year. We are in the process of updating for 2020. We also are delegated by Federal Highway Association to provide oversight. We do a process review once a year where we look at certain performance measures and we write a report on those. Both of these are posted online. If you have any questions on how to procure an A&E consultant contract, you will use our Local Assistance Procedure Manual. We do not create regulations. Process review, again, we do a yearly compliance assessment. In 2014, it was found that 49% of local agencies were compliant with 14 categories reviewed. We did another review in 2017. We found 77% of the local agencies were compliant with our review, and 2018, 82%. We're on the upward trend. We'd like to hit at least 85. When we hit 85 on some of these performance measures, we drop them off if there's 2 consecutive reviews done where they're at 85% compliance. So we do target different areas based on our interpretation of the need and also audit reports on what's important. What we found when we did our last process review is that we had 4 areas that were below our target that we are actually targeting this year for improvement. 24% of the agencies reviewed passed the cost analysis, 38% did well on cost and fee negotiations, 60% policy and procedures, and 65% on the secondary score sheets. Since these are low, we are definitely targeting this year, and this training is focused on these 4 items. Important links. We have our own website for A&E procurement. It's the Consultant Selection Procurement. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do. We post everything that we produce on this website. If you have any guidance or questions that you would like clarified, let us know, because we have the power to create new guidance for you. We also have a local assistance blog. This is where we send out all notifications of anything that we feel is worthy of release. So if you don't subscribe to the blog, please do. That is our mode of communication. We also have the constant contact email list. If you are not subscribed, please do that. And again, if you have any questions, please use the chat box. Make sure that you choose panelists and attendees both. So that way we actually get the questions. Questions will be answered at the end at a later date in writing. And this will be given to everyone on the webinar and who has attended the in-person trainings. So we break our training out into 5 main categories. We see these as the critical points of doing a procurement. My portion today is going to be procurement planning. I will go over what that entails, and then later we'll hear from Trina, Full and Open, and Carol, Qualification-Based, and then John, Cost is Fair and Reasonable, and Contract Execution. So we're saying if you know these 5 key areas, you should be pretty good on procurement. We'll go into particulars on what these actually entail. Procurement planning. There's 2 portions to procurement planning. One is what you would see for all of your contracts. These are items that you have in place for everything. That would be A&E policy and procedures, master agreement, conflict of interest policies, who your contract administrator is going to be, and then we'll go through the second phase of the other planning when you do your contract administration. So what is applicable to all contracts? That would be policy and procedures. According to the CFR, the state, us, are responsible to make sure that our recipients, the local agencies, have capacity and measures in place to properly procure an A&E contract. We provide guidance for that. We also have the authority to adopt a written policy and procedure prescribed by the state. So we have in fact done that in Chapter 10. It says, hey, adopt ours and you will be compliant with that regulation. Our LAPM Chapter 10 is what we focus on with the A&E group, and that has been vetted by local agencies and FHWA. So written policy and procedures, you need to have one of those in place. I guarantee you that you do have one in place. You'll need to read and see what that is and see if it's outdated, needs to be updated, and what's in it, and then also know what's in ours. A master agreement. If you do business with the Division of Local Assistance, you're going to have a master agreement. But within this master agreement has the requirements that you're required to meet. Within that, starting around page 8, Fiscal Provisions, it lists the federal regulations and state regulations and any audit requirements that you need to meet in there. So it will call out 23 CFR 172. It'll call out the California Government Code and 2 CFR 200. All of these you need to adhere to, and it will be in your master agreement. Master agreement is good for every project. When you come in for a project, you'll get a program supplement agreement, which is project specific. To know what's in your master agreement. You also have a conflict of interest policy for your agency. If you're an agency in the state of California, you have a written policy and procedure. This policy and procedure is different than our Exhibit 10T, which we'll go over later, which is project specific, to show no conflict of interest. But above and beyond that is your conflict of interest policy that you have with your agency. Make sure you read that, know what's in it. That may need to be updated also. But if you have a consultant in a management support role and you come to us for approval through FHWA, this is the one item that they're going to request along with your scope of work right off the bat. So they're going to look to see what kind of conflict of interest policy that your agency has. Also, for every contract, you're going to have a contract administrator. The contract administrator is responsible for these items and more. So we want to bring this to your attention because Chapter 10 mentions that your contract administrator needs to be a full-time public personnel, and you'll see later why that is needed. It's kind of hard to do these items if you're not a full-time personnel, but that person is basically responsible for the procurement process from beginning to end. Actually, the whole contract from beginning to end. They really need to have a good handle on the particulars of the contract. So they're actually going to make sure that all the records are retained, do their independent cost estimate. They're going to be involved in the negotiations, choosing the committee members, and then of course monitoring that contract and invoice payments. So now that we've gone over the overall that you need for every consultant contract, we're going to look at when you come in for each contract, what are you going to be looking at? We're going to go over the planning project objectives, the scope of work, independent cost estimate, method of payment, and a consultant in a management support role. Procurement planning. First and foremost, you got to select a project. This is normally done with your FTIP or MTIP, so you know what projects you're going to have. You're going to set your project objectives and of course determine your schedule. There are two schedules that go in your solicitation document. That would be a procurement schedule and also your work schedule. You're going to identify the need for a consultant. If you don't have a need for a consultant, you shouldn't hire one. You have to have a need or you should be doing the work in-house. So you want to identify what is the need for your consultant. Do you not have the capacity in-house or the expertise? You're also going to appoint your contract administrator. The scope of work. The scope of work is probably the largest issue that we see, but also one of the most important items to have detailed. It needs to be complete, clear, and concise. It tells the whole breadth of the work that you're going to do. It has specific task details, especially if you're doing project specific, and what deliverables. Keep in mind the scope of work is a living document. It can evolve as your process goes along. So you can ask for details from your scope of work to be provided in your consultant's proposal. There's nothing wrong with asking for further tasks so you can build your scope of work properly. Once you execute your contract, you're going to have a detailed scope of work that goes in that. We do have a scope of work writing guide that we have posted at the link listed on our A&E website. It goes over the thinking of how to do a scope of work. So it doesn't have particular scopes of work. We're working on those also to provide, but this goes over the thought process on how do you develop a scope of work and what does that actually mean. So please check that out. But your first and foremost, think about your scope of work that needs to be detailed. What do you need the consultant to do? Everyone needs to be clear. That will go in your solicitation. Also, a question to ask is, do you need an A&E consultant? What type of consultant are you looking for? Is it A&E, non-A&E? Well, the definition of an A&E consultant is it going to be performed, approved, or provided by a licensed or registered personnel, such as an engineer or an architect? That's the main question to ask. Does that person need certain certifications or a license? If it's one of these categories, it's probably considered an A&E consultant. Are you looking for program management, construction management, environmental, engineering, or design? It's probably going to be most likely an A&E. Keep that in mind. You should be going down the A&E procurement path. But if it's right-of-way acquisitions only, not right-of-way surveying, or testing, not analyzing results, just doing the physical testing, or planning studies or public outreach, it very well may be non-A&E. Non-A&E has different requirements, different codes that are followed. Non-A&E follows the California Public Contract Code, and that code is listed on your screen. Independent cost estimate. The next item that is important is the independent cost estimate. In order to be considered a true independent cost estimate by the federal regulations, is it needs to contain these items. It needs to have work or labor hours, the types or classifications of labor, direct salary or wage rates, and then your other direct costs. Make sure you have other direct costs. Those are listed. The quantity may not be known. It would be an actual quantity, but you would know the unit costs on that. Also, consultant's fixed fee. You should have an idea of what the fixed fee should be. It's not the maximum allowed, which is 15%. It would be based on what you think is reasonable. That is something that you'll calc. John will go over that later. Indirect costs, indirect cost rate, that is something that you'll have to guesstimate in the beginning, because you're going to use the actual indirect cost rate that was approved by our Audits and Investigations Division for their rate. That is a non-negotiable item. So independent cost estimate needs to have these items. Even if you don't start out with these items, your independent cost estimate before you go into negotiation needs to have these items. So we'll take a look at a sample estimate. A lot of agencies start with analogous. As you can tell, the analogous does not have all of the items on it, but it's perfectly fine to start out with this. If this is what you have and this is the information that you have in your historical documentation, you can certainly use this. You want to pick a project that is definitely very similar in the scope of work and the tasks. Here we have an agency that chose 4 projects to compare. Again, if you start with that, add those other items on there, the indirect cost rates, the other direct costs, the fee, to end up with a proper independent cost estimate. So what we're saying is an independent assessment would be, what do you expect to pay for the services? You don't want to go in negotiations without anything. We're asking that you need to be prepared. You can use historical prices, the industry standard, and market survey. You're going to have everything lined up, so when you go in to negotiate, you're going to look at what the firm thinks that they should pay for the services. So all we're asking is that independent assessment is really your set of standards on what you think is appropriate for that contract. So please do your independent cost estimate. That is one of our target items that we review. Bottom-up estimate definitely has all of the critical items. If you add the other direct costs and indirect costs and fee, this one takes a little bit more, maybe a lot more thought, because it's from the ground up, from the basic tasks. But this is our expectation of what we'd like to see agencies end up with. We do have this, I believe, posted online also on what that would be. So if we look at it, it will have the types or classifications of the labor. You want to make sure that the type of personnel that you expect is the type of personnel that ends up on your contract. It would be inappropriate to have a principal engineer do all of the work and charge principal engineering prices when a drafter would do. Also, the tasks need to have enough tasks in there so everyone is aware of the expectation and you can properly have a cost when you go to negotiate. The hourly rate, again, you can look that up through different modes. You can certainly ask the agency for their actual rates. Also, your indirect cost rate, again, that is a non-negotiable item. That is one that they have gone through our audits and investigations. If your contract is less than $150,000, that is on the agency to verify the indirect cost rate is an acceptable rate. The profit fee, again, John will go over that later on how to calc that, but that is what's reasonable for your contract. Or look at what your agency has in place. You might have a policy that says your maximum profit rate that you will accept is a certain percentage. Again, this one has work or labor hours. What is the expectation? How long do you feel that a task would take? That's what you're going to negotiate. Next, you want to determine the method of payment. This does need to be listed in your solicitation. What is the expectation of your method of payment? There's 4 recognized through the CFR. There's the cost per unit of work. We don't see that one as often, maybe on technical or materials testing type projects. Lump sum, we wanted to point out that it's not the same as a firm fixed fee. Lump sum can be changed if needed, if the scope of work is a little bit different. Firm fixed fee cannot be changed at all. That's not a listing in the CFR. So we just want to point out those are different. Lump sum takes a little bit more effort up front, but is definitely the easiest contract to manage. The cost plus fixed fees generally done for project specific type projects, and we'll go over that here in a minute. And then the specific rate of compensation, which is normally used for on-calls, and it does have certain caveats that go with it that need to be addressed if you're going to use that type of payment. Cost plus a percentage of costs and percentage of construction costs are not allowed on A&E contracts or construction contracts. If you do not have a maximum amount specified on your on-call, it is considered a cost plus percentage of costs. You go over your max dollar amount, that amount is not reimbursable. So that's why we're pretty clear, pretty serious on the maximum dollar amount and the maximum 5 years for an on-call contract. We have an example of a cost plus fixed fee just to show you how that works, and also the difference between that and the specified rates. So we're going to look at a senior engineer that gets paid $250 an hour. Again, the ICR is what they have gotten approved through our audits and investigations. We're looking at a base 100 hours and a fixed fee of 10%. Again, is the fee reasonable? That's on the agency to figure out, but you cannot go over 15% according to the CFR unless you have really special circumstances. So we're looking at $250 an hour. The 2.5 multiplier comes from the ICR times 100 hours. We're looking at a total of $68,000. If you exceed the labor hours, of course, your amount's going to go up, but the fixed fee remains the same. So cost plus fixed fee, that fee is fixed for the life of the contract, unless you have to add some kind of scope, which remember that has to be this within the solicitation. You can't add scope outside of what the solicitation was, but your fixed fee in general stays for the life of the contract. So we're looking at a total of $81,000. When the hours are less, you're looking at, of course, less money. But again, the main point is the fixed fee stays the same. Whatever fee you calculate on that base hour is what the consultant is expecting for the life of the contract. Specific rate of compensation, I mentioned earlier that there's special caveats that go along with it, but this is reimbursement at a loaded billing rate, and we'll show you what that means here in a minute. For on-call contracts, again, you have to specify a maximum not to exceed dollar amount. That needs to go in the solicitation. Everyone needs to know upfront what the expectation is. If you have a maximum dollar amount of $500,000, your contract should not be $2 million at the end. The consultants have the expectation of, oh, I'm going to get a contract for $500,000. In the CFR, it says for a specific rate of compensation should be used only when your work or the cost cannot be estimated, which is appropriate for an on-call contract, or the contracting agency is in control of the hours worked. So on a project specific, the consultant is in control of the hours worked. It's whatever that amount of time takes to finish that task. On call, you have task orders. You're in control of the hours worked. On an on-call or a specific rate of compensation type contract, the agency must manage and monitor these contracts. That's one of the issues we find with our audits investigations this year, is actually on the managing of these on-call contracts. So again, please don't go over your maximum contract amount. That is seen as a different type of payment, and the costs are most likely ineligible. Specific rate of compensation, if you use this type of payment, we'll look at the same baseline example. We have a $250 an hour senior engineer with the ICR of 150. Fixed fee again is 10%. We're looking at 100 hours, it's the same, $68,750. When it's exceeded 120 hours, we're looking at 82,000. When the hours are less, we're looking at 55,000. But the fee, since it's loaded in this rate already, it can change over time. So if we're looking at the same actual cost plus fixed fee, which at 100 hours, and the specific rate of compensation at 100 hours, it's the same. Where the difference comes in is when the hours go over, and that's where you're going to see the biggest jump in difference. So that's where it's critical on the contract management to make sure that there's no abuse or fraud within that type of contract, because you could have a contract cost savings of $1,250 just within that 20-hour difference. So make sure that you have the correct method of payment for the type of contract that you have. And if you're going to use the specific rates, make sure that you have good management tools. Next, I'm going to talk about a consultant in a management support role. We wanted to bring this to everyone's attention. This is one of our largest audit findings, is this process has conflict of interest potential. So we want to go over those and make everyone aware. We do have a process that needs to be followed for what we're calling a CMSR, consultant in a management support role. FHWA has not delegated that authority to us. So they have to review and approve every CMSR that is comes through our office. So basically, what is a CMSR? Most often it's city engineer. It could be a project manager. If that person is choosing projects or making decisions on behalf of your agency, that's kind of the key word, decisions on behalf of your agency, then they're most likely a CMSR. If you're not sure, send it to us. We will send it to FHWA if it's something that we're not sure of, if it's a CMSR, and they'll make the determination. You want to be sure that you're safe on if it is or if it isn't. If it isn't, no problem. You have that determination in your file. But if it is, you need to make sure you go through the process. That could be a big fine for not doing that. And basically we say, do they dictate or persuade, such as choosing projects and where projects are at, making decisions for your agency, or are they just executing what projects or plans that you already have in place? So ask yourself those questions. The local agency is still responsible to have someone in charge of that contract. We call them the responsible charge. It needs to be a full-time public employee. That person, and this is where the issues come in for us with audits, has to do these items listed on this slide. So they're the person that's going to be making sure the contract negotiations, the payments, they're overseeing this contract when it goes through. Also, make sure you understand what's in the contract. It's the responsible charge doesn't have to be the person, and normally they're not. That's why you hire a city engineer. They're not the person with the license, not the person stamping the plans. They're the person, though, that is overseeing that CMSR in the role that they're playing. So we want to make sure that agencies know that you have to have a person in responsible charge that has the experience and expertise to actually oversee those projects. We do have the CFR listed, some of the activities that they need to make sure are adhered to. So we're saying for the conflict of interest, the best practices: don't have your consultant perform the design and construction management. Don't have them check their own work. That is a conflict of interest. Try to separate those roles. If not, have a policy and procedure in place. We realize this is one of our biggest issues. We are working on creating documents to help agencies what a scope of work would look like, how to mitigate conflict of interest, what a good conflict of interest policy would look like. So keep a watch out for that. That will be coming. Also, another example is if they're doing construction inspection or testing, that they're not doing the QA and the QC. So what is our CMSR approval process? Again, determine if you have a need for the CMSR, whether it is paid by state or local funding. If it is overseeing a federal project, it needs to go through the CMSR approval process. FHWA is there to really help agencies avoid that conflict of interest, which is what we're seeing pop up on our audits this year. So if you need a CMSR, you'll submit your scope of work and your conflict of interest policy to our email at aneoversight@dot.ca.gov. We will send that to FHWA for review. We'll check it over to see if everything's complete there. Send it to FHWA. They will approve that. Once they approve that, then you can move forward and advertise your solicitation. Because again, they're checking the scope of work to make sure that it's properly defined for that to help you out. So you're going to advertise the RFQ. You're going to select your consultant and get your 10U. You're going to submit that 10U again to A&E Oversight, because FHWA also has to approve that. So once they approve that, then you're good to go for your process. but please remember to follow the CMSR approval process for those type of contracts. You will get a copy back for your file. So most frequent errors and deficiencies that we see are the incomplete independent cost estimate. Again, you need to have those 6 items on your independent cost estimate for it to be a true independent cost estimate. Just be prepared when you go into your negotiations that you're at an equal playing field with your consultant. We also see inadequate record keeping. If you don't have it written, you didn't do it. So you need to make sure that you have all documentation. Even if you think it's a minor thing, just throw it in your file. You need to retain these for a period of 3 years after the final voucher. And of course, the policy and procedures adoption. This is a big target for us. FHWA expects to see everyone compliant with having a good policy and procedures that meets all of the federal regulations. Our LAPM, we believe, meets that. We are going to do an update in 2020 that will we'll work with FHWA to make sure that that is definitely good to go. Again, following is different than having one adopted. So forms and resources, we have, again, our own A&E website. So please check that out. If you are procuring a consultant, use Chapter 10. It will tell you what you need to know. Again, if there's something that's not clear in there, if you need more guidance, general questions, send them our way, because again, we update that every year, and we will take your questions and concerns seriously. The 10T, we'll go over that later, but essentially the 10Ts are conflict of interest for that contract. Make sure you fill that out. All of your committee members and anyone actually that touches that procurement probably should fill out the 10T to show that there's no conflict of interest. And then of course the 10U, when you have a CMSR, you have to go through that process. Okay, and again, please type your questions in. We will answer those. We'll send out those questions to everyone in writing. And of course, maybe I hit some buttons there that, okay, that's good. We're good to go. So in recap, independent cost estimate, your scope of work, make sure you know it's in all of your agreements that you have with the state. And I will turn it over to Trina, who's making her way up to the podium. She's going to go over full and open competition.
Thank you, Felicia. Hello, everyone. This is Trina Luo from Caltrans, Division of Local Assistance, A&E Oversight Unit. Just as we mentioned, the procurement process can be divided into 5 stages according to the timeline. Felicia has shared with you the requirements, policies, and the procedures related with the first stage, which is procurement planning stage. Now we are entering into the second stage, full and open competition. After you finish the procurement planning stage, you have the draft RFP or RFQ ready in your hand. Then you would like to advertise it and try to get some consultants to propose on it. Since we are public agencies reside in California, both our department and your agency needs to meet the general requirements listed in the Public Contract Code we call Pcc. If you use federal highway funds in your project, you need to meet the requirements listed in 2 CFR, 23 CFR, 48 CFR, and the 49 CFR as well, quite a bit. Pcc Section 100 states all public contracts must be awarded in a competitive environment, either competitive negotiation or competitive bidding. 2 CFR 200 states the competition must be full and open. In this stage, you need to be familiar with the requirements of advertisement, understand two steps, RFP, RFQ process, and how to develop DBE goals. Carol will guide you through the DBE goal setting methodology after my presentation. In United States Code Title 40, Section 1101 to 1104, which is well known for Brooks Act, states A&E procurement needs to use qualification-based selection, and it is codified by Federal Highway in 23 CFR Part 172. In Part 72, you will find 3 types of procurement methods. The first one is competitive negotiation. The second one is small purchase, which is once your contract cost is less than $250,000, you can use the state A&E procurement process. The third one is non-competitive negotiation, which is sole source. This will be covered in next stage, qualification selection stage. I would like to explain the difference between the competitive negotiation and the competitive bidding. Competitive negotiations is to use qualification-based selection, means the selection is based on the demonstrated competency and the professional qualifications. While the competitive bidding is the selection based on the cost to select the lowest responsive bidder. Because the California Government Code 4525 to 4529 states all A&E procurements shall be based on qualifications, regardless of the contract cost, which we call the Mini-Brooks Act. So physically in California, no small purchase for A&E procurement. Qualification-based selection is well explained in the competitive negotiation, and it covers full and open competition. Remember, price cannot be considered as a factor to evaluate the consultants in A&E procurement. As for competition, how can it be full and open? We will discuss this in 3 categories. The first one is advertisement. The second one is process requirements. And the third one is selection committee best practices. For the advertisement, first, you need to publicly announce the advertisement. All in-state and out-of-state firms should be given opportunities to propose. You can advertise your RFP and RFQ on your website, national-wide trade journals, and online forums. Please be aware, putting your solicitation on your local newspapers does not meet the requirements. Since consulting firms reside in other regions, may not get your newspapers, so they don't know you're gonna have some projects issue out. And the advertisement period is a minimum 14 days. Do not be confused with the construction bidding time. This is 21 days. And the best practice for A&E advertisement period is to not use 14 days, the minimum requirement, because if you use 14 days period, it may eliminate some of the firms to submit their proposals because they have a heavy load. Second, in the RFP, RFQ, requirements and evaluation factors need to be clearly stated. And besides the requirements on the advertisement and the evaluation criteria, the proposal evaluation needs to be performed independently. For a simple specific project, an RFP is sufficient to select the consultants. But for some very complicated projects, we would like to use multi-phases procurement. And sometimes we would like to streamline the process and are willing to do some heavy lifting in the beginning. Good news is the 2 steps procurement process is allowed in 23 CFR Part 172. Before we jump onto the 2 steps process, I would like to clarify 2 terms here, shortlist and the pre-qualification list. The shortlist, which means we get the statement of qualification, we evaluate and rank the consultants. So shortlist leads to contracts, and we can control how many firms to be shortlisted. As for pre-qual list, just evaluate and no ranking, because it's simply pass and fail, pass or fail. For the pre-qualification list, you need to update your list no longer than 2 years, and annually updates are encouraged. We cannot control the number of firms to be listed on the pre-qual list, because if the firm wants to propose their qualification, they can provide information and be on the list. Just as we mentioned, 2-step procurement method requires more effort initially, and it's fit for establish a pre-qualification list and select on-call consultants, which is short list, and also fit for a very complicated project using multi-phase procurement method. We will discuss 2 steps using pre-qual list and a short list in the next couple slides. When using 2 steps, if the intention is to establish a pre-qual list, here are the requirements for the RFQ. You need to first define the scope of work, which is what type of work or services you want to solicit. And you need to state the minimum requirements in your RFQ as well. And again, update the list annually are encouraged, but you need to update the list no longer than 2 years. With the pre-qualification list, when you have a project, you need to advertise your project specific RFP. This RFP is the full QBS. Send the RFP to all the consultants on the pre-qualification list and follow the 1-step RFP requirements. It's a full-blown QBS, Qualification-Based Selection. I would like to address one thing, why we need to update the pre-qual list annually or no longer than 2 years. Because in a year or 2, some new firms may pop up, and some older firms may lose their expertise. To be full and open, you need to give the new firms some opportunities to bid or propose their proposal. If using the 2 steps procurement to get a short list, and since short list leads to contracts, the RFQ is quite different. Besides listing the scope of work and the minimum requirements in the RFQ, your RFQ also needs to include number of contracts you want to issue. Typically, the number will be 3 to 5. We select 3 to 5 consultants to perform the on-call services. And we state the contract cost ceiling amount. Here, please note, once the not to exceed ceiling amount was set, no contract amendment can increase the not to exceed ceiling amount, which means the ceiling amount is fixed. You cannot adjust after you execute your contract. And in your RFQ, you also need to determine the period of performance. Please be aware the maximum length for the on-call contract is 5 years. and no extension after 5 years. You also need to set the DBE goals for the master on-call contract and then negotiate price with the top-ranked firms. And in your RFQ, you also need to you also need to include a statement on how to issue the task orders, either by predetermined geographic regions or use minimal RFPs. If you use mini RFPs, you need to include the criteria and the process in your RFQ as well. Yeah, this is this is the difference from the pre-qual list. Yeah, we highlight those, negotiating, and provide the next phase, how you're gonna select the task orders. Now we need to talk about the best practices for selection committee. We highly suggest the selection committee needs to be minimum 3 people. If only 1 person to select the consultants, this will be challenged since we are human beings. All of us have unconscious bias. If 2 people on the committee, how to deal with a tight condition, right? That's why we suggest the 3 people minimum to sit on the selection committee. And I also would like to address one thing more is for the multi-on-call consultants, which is a short list. For the I'm sorry, I missed one slide. Yeah, for the RFP, we have some requirements for the mini RFPs as well. We need to include task orders, scope of work, and we need to send the RFP to all the on-call consultants. And please remember, do not use cost as an evaluation factor. And it is a full-blown QBS process. And you need to evaluate proposal and get the top-ranked firms, negotiate the cost and the fees with the top-ranked firms as well. I would like to suggest one thing here. When we issue the on-call contracts, the cost of proposal most likely will be using the specific rate of compensation. That type of payment method has some requirements. One of the requirements is only work or cost cannot be estimated. So you can use the specific rate of compensation. But when you have the task orders, you will be able to estimate your work or cost. So I highly suggest you negotiate your task orders cost proposal using cost plus fixed fee payment method. And now we kind of continue our consultant selection committee's topic. And since this is the qualification-based selection, each committee member needs to have some subject-related knowledge on how to score the consultants. That's why we suggest the subject matter expert to sit on the committee. And sometimes the contract administrator can serve the purpose if he or she has a knowledge. In this case, if the contract administrator serves the purpose on the committee, the contract administrator's conflict of interest exhibit needs to be signed off by his or her supervisor. Please be aware, participation of Caltrans employee does not relieve the local agency responsibility to meet the requirements. Yeah, Felicia addressed the conflict of interest issues and the policies, and then we would like to address the conflict of interest again because we find a lot of the findings through our performance review and audit investigation. Conflict of interest is really an issue now. 2 CFR 200, the uniform requirements for all federal agency lists conflict of interest requirements in part 200, 112. 23 CFR lists the conflict of interest requirements also, and our state government code states the conflict of interest policy in section 1090. We, the Division of Local Assistance, created an exhibit to help you to meet the requirements. Each of the selection panel member needs to sign and date the exhibit 10T before jumping onto the procurement process. Okay, let's get to the next slide. Each selection panel member will be given a set of proposal and a scoring sheet. For the scoring sheet, the evaluation criteria listed on the scoring sheet needs to be identical to those listed in your RFP or RFQ. And the evaluation criteria should carry weights and related to the scope of work or the service you want to solicit. All the scoring sheets need to be signed and dated. And if second evaluation or interview was held, retain the secondary scoring sheet. Attached here is the exhibit 10B we created for your reference. And you can customize it to fit your needs. And with this one, I conclude my presentation and pass on to Carol for the DBE topic.
All right. Thanks, Trina. All right. So for today, we are going to discover the mystery behind the contract goal, DBE contract goal. DBE stands for Disadvantaged Business Enterprise. It's just basically establishing your contract goal for your procurement contract. It's just your subcontracting opportunities available out there for the little guys just to help spread the wealth, basically. So where do you start with the determining the DBE goal? You start with Exhibit 9D. Make sure that you always have Exhibit 9D regardless of the amount of your contract. For Exhibit 9D, there are two ways to submit it, depending on the amount of your contract. One of them is the threshold is basically the $500,000. Below the $500,000, you have to complete it and still submit it to your DLAE. Above $500,000, it still have to be submitted to the DLAE, but DLAE then is responsible to submitting it to OGO, which is the, there's an inbox for the OGO for the DBE goals. So basically the main thing is your Exhibit 9D needs to be submitted to your DLAE. Below 500,000, it is retained on the project file on the district side. Anything above is submitted to OGO inbox. There are 7 simple steps for establishing the DBE goal. Let me just point you out to what is the difference between the previous ones when we first have the DBE goal to the present one. So it's basically step 3 and step 6. Step 3 is the availability of the DBE firms. It's now less than 10. It used to be less than 7. Then you have to establish the DBE goal. It used to be 10. And also the step 6, which is the 80% up factor. It used to be 60%. But let me run you through the 7 simple steps. Basically, it's just you're just identifying the work, whatever work is available out there for your subcontracting. Then you go to your database, which establishes the category codes for subcontracting. You search your database for the available DBE firms. So again, if it's less than 7, you have to have a DBE goal. You apply the DBE factors to the sub work, which will give you a calculated soft goal. You apply the 80% factor and you just round it up to the nearest whole number. So how do you establish the DBE goal? For on-call contract, just like what my previous colleague said, your DBE contract has to be listed in your solicitation. There's a few things that change on the DBE goal, and we added that, and I will discuss that in a little bit. So for this example, your DBE goal is 11%. Remember, for your DBE goal, Exhibit 1001 needs to be in your solicitation. Then the difference between 1001 and 1002, 1001 is just a percentage, and 1002 will reflect your dollar amount. Here's an example of determining the DBE goal. Local agency determined that their project will require environmental support, which they determined based on their cost estimate. Environmental support will need 7%. CAD services, 4%. Solicitation goes out. Consultant determined that they could meet your environmental support, which is 6%, but they don't have any CAD services, but they have the construction management services at 5%. This still meets the on-call contract DBE goal because it's still 11%. 6 and 5 is 11, 7 and 4 is 11, so the consultant still is meeting the DBE goal. Later on, the consultant, the work materializes. For this task order number 1, there's a preliminary roadway design and then environmental support. The environmental support is for $2,000 and the roadway design is $98,000. So technically, by calculating it, the estimated DBE by agency is 2,000 divided by 100,000 is 2%. Another task order came up, which is for the final roadway design for $135,000. CM is $15,000. That is basically the DBE that was submitted by the consultant. The estimated DBE for this agency is now 10%. Let me point you out to a new requirement on how to track your DBE. We are introducing a new exhibit, which is the 10G. 10G is what you will need to track the DBE usage for your task orders. Remember, for an on-call contract, you have multiple contracts, and sometimes, or most of the times when your task order is done, you need to close the project. But in order for you to close the project, you will need a DBE utilization. So in this case, we introduced the Exhibit 10G. So in closing out the project, remember, you still need a 17F, which is part of your project completion report, in order to close the entire master contract. So for this case, you only have a 6.8% DBE goal. Yes, you do not meet the 11%, and that is okay because the task orders or the work did not materialize. So this is the new Form 10G, which you will use to track your DBE goal. It's called the Individual A&E Task Order DBE Tracking Sheet. If you have multiple projects, all your task orders has to be recorded on the 10G, and in the culmination of the on-call contract, you will eventually, the accumulation of all 10G will equate to a 17F, I'm sorry. So here's an example of DBE goal utilization for a master on-call contract, project specific number 1. You have a project which is a BRLO 411015. You have 3 phases, which is the PE, the surveying, which is an on-call, and a construction contractor. Project number 2, which is the 016, you have a PE, which is done in-house, so this doesn't have a contract. You have a surveying on-call and a construction contract. This is what I'm trying to point out, that you will still need a 17F. So there will be 2 17Fs for this contract, which is one is for the contractor and one is for the on-call surveying. Just like what I mentioned before, the 17F for on-call surveying is supported by all the 10Gs for the task orders. So here's a list of frequent errors and deficiencies we find when doing the on-call contract. This is also part of Trina's presentation. So some of them are the lack of the evaluation criteria. Make sure you have weights on your evaluation criteria, because how are you supposed to evaluate your consultant if you do not have weights? There's also missing conflict of interest statements. The method of payments, remember, the method of payments needs to be part of your solicitation. The cost proposal is not specified. Inadequate undocumented advertisement method, and then documentation of your responsiveness review checklist. Some of them also are procurement, missing the procurement schedule. I mean, you have to have a schedule. You gotta have a beginning and an end for your contract. The oral interviews are not identified. Sometimes your contract type is missing, your method of payment. The length of contract is not included on your on-call. Remember, especially for on-call, you have the maximum dollar amount and the length of contract. The DBE goals has to be specified in your on-call contract or in your solicitation. Exhibit 10R is the mandatory fiscal provisions. This is one of the exhibits that you could tailor to your need. It does not have to, as long as you do not change the intent of the provisions in the 10R. And your CMS are not approved for solicitation. I believe Trina and Felicia dealt with the CMSR. Some of the forms and resources available for you are listed in LAPM Chapter 10. Some of the forms are required and you cannot change them, like the 10R and the 10I. However, some of the forms, just like the 10B and 10H, are for you to use and change or edit as it suits your needs. After, we're now going to proceed with the qualification-based selection. So there are ways to procure your contracts. One of them is through the qualification-based and sole source. Here are the elements for the qualification-based selection. We'll deal with it a little bit more later in the later slides, but the elements for the QBS is price is not allowed. You could do sole source. You have to have a responsiveness checklist to evaluate your consultants, the evaluation and selection procedures, and some of the frequent errors. So qualification-based procedures is codified under a CFR Part 172 and State Government Code 4525 and 4529. Remember that the QBS is qualification-based, so price, you cannot use price as a factor to hire or your consultant. Why do we need to consider, why can't we not consider price? It's because you want the most qualified consultant for your project. Remember, this is different from construction. It's competitive negotiation. Construction is low bid. Please remember the California regulations does not require A&E consultants to select the based on the cost. For your qualification-based selections, you have to have evaluation criteria, and you need to retain all your score sheets. If your solicitation listed that you will have an interview, you have to make sure that you actually conduct an interview. Remember that there should be evaluation criteria for interviews also, and you have to retain that in your project file. Sole sourcing is allowed under, sole sourcing is another way to procure your contract, but it's only allowed under the following circumstances. One is there's only one consultant qualified to perform the work during an emergency situation, which is the emergency opening, not the permanent restoration. So it's emergency opening only. And competition is determined to be inadequate after number of solicitation sources. So let me proceed and discuss each one of them. So after advertisement, let's say you only receive one proposal. If there's only one proposal, you are required to submit Exhibit 12F, which needs to be approved by your DLAE. Please remember that even though it's only one proposal, you still need to evaluate the qualification of the consultant and make sure that you negotiate a fair and reasonable price for the services. Just don't take their proposal. Make sure that it's fair and reasonable. For responsiveness review, you have to establish submittal requirements, the minimum requirements, and some evaluation criteria. Make sure that you have a responsiveness checklist, because you could get challenged on this one. One example is if they said that they're supposed to submit it at the end of the month, or let's say August 30th at 5 p.m. and somebody submitted some September 1st at 3 p.m. You should put that as part of a responsiveness log in your responsiveness checklist. Here's an example of the responsiveness checklist. This is just an example. You could always modify it according to your need. We are providing this as part of your, to help you guys, guide you through how to write a responsiveness checklist. But just as I mentioned, you could always tailor it to your need. 1001, just like I mentioned, it has to be part of your solicitation, it will list the percentage of the DBE from your contracts. It describes your work services, the DBE certification number. DBE certification number is found in the database from the CUCP. The DBE contract information is also found on the database, and the percentage that you've determined that you could, the DBE percentage of the DBE consultants available for this particular contract. Some of the evaluation and selection consultants, so after you solicited, it comes back, now you're ready to convene the selection committee. You review the proposals. You complete the score sheets and sign and date all the original sheets. The contract administrator compiles all the scoring and ranking. Just like what I've said, if your solicitation listed interviews, you have to make sure that you do conduct your interviews. From there, you shortlist it to top 3 or 5 firms, and you have to inform the top 3 firms on the shortlist for final ranking. We suggest 3 to 5 firms because if you only have 3 firms, one dropped out, and that means you only have 2 firms. You might have to proceed with submit a justification. The committee also developed a standard for questions. This is just a suggested best practice. One person can do a reference check. All this must be done prior to an oral interview. And all this must have to be documented and put in your file. For the evaluation and selection of consultants, you prepare for the interviews of a short list. You have to send them an interview agenda, the questions, and the score sheets. That way they know what when they're ready for the interview, at least they know what they're expecting. You also have to have a copy of a standard agreement, so at least they know what kind of conditions they are agreeing to. The cost proposal has to be in a sealed envelope. Do not open the cost proposals. And cost proposals need to be returned if they submitted all at the same time and then you started negotiating with the top consultant, the remainder of the cost proposal needs to be returned, or you should have at least a procedure in your written procedures on how to destroy the cost proposals. Moving on to the evaluation of and selection of consultants, you can conduct the interviews for a short list. Just like I said, you collect the cost proposal in a sealed envelope. It depends on how you want the cost proposal. You could have them all at the same time, or you could ask for it one at a time. But remember, if you receive it one at a time, you have to do the extra mile of returning the sealed cost proposals if you started negotiating with the top consultants. So now let's see, here's a sample of the compiling and ranking the consultants. There are 2 ways to rank it. It's either you do the raw score or the ranking score. You cannot, or we said raw score is just a raw score. It's not the final score because it's very subjective. So in this example, you will see that firm ABC has a raw score of 85 and a rank score of number 3, but firm EFG has 86 and a rank score of 2. So moving on to that one, firm XYZ have ranked 5, 4, and 5. You sum the ranking, gives you 14. The final ranking, if you notice here, firm EFG has a raw score of 234. No, let me take that back. Firm RST has a ranking of raw score of 236, but EFG still ranks first. So this is what I'm saying, that you cannot use as a raw score as your basis because it's very subjective. Firm Joe White and Sue Green and Alice Black, it could differ based on how they perceive the consultant, and one could rank them really high, but the other one could, give them a raw score of really high, but the other one's probably not ranking it. It could rank it really low based on the raw score. Here are the most frequent errors for the QBS. There's the lack of retention original score sheets and inadequate documentation. The actual evaluation criteria differ from the original. Make sure whatever you put out on your solicitation, it has to carry through. It's like from cradle to grave. Whatever evaluation criteria you put out on your solicitation, it has to be the same evaluation criteria when they come in for an interview. Some of the forms and resources for our QBS, you verify that the proposal meet the responsiveness items, just like what I said previously. If you said they have to be submitted at a certain time and submitted later than that, they will be considered non-responsive. Your proposal has to be distributed to all selection committee on the same, whatever is in the solicitation. You evaluate based on your published criteria in the solicitation. If you want to conduct the interview, it has to be listed in your solicitation. If not, then you're okay. You rank your top 3 consultant and select the most qualified consultant. You retain all evaluation sheets. Just like I said, evaluation sheets, the first one, the written one, and then if you have the interview, they have to be separate evaluation sheets. So if you have 4 consultants and then you have 3 panels, you have a 12 evaluation sheets. And then if you want to do interviews on top of that, you will have another 12 evaluation sheets just for the oral interview. So it's a total of like 24. Make sure it's not an executive sheets. I've seen some of the evaluation, they are all in an executive summary sheet. Each one of the panel have to have a separate evaluation sheet, so it does not influence the evaluation of one panel to the other. So it has to be separate. And from that, I will hand it on to John for the cost is fair and reasonable and contract execution. John.
Thank you, Carol. Before I start on my portion on the cost is fair and reasonable in contract execution, I want to do a recap of what has been presented for this training. So in procurement planning, we have the guiding principles: procurement planning, full and open competition, qualifications-based selections, cost is fair and reasonable, and then it's wrapping it up, it's the contract execution. So in that procurement planning, it is very important that before you start, you understand what the A&E policy and procedures are, what your master agreement, the requirements that are in your master agreement. There's a lot of resource. Visit our website. Felicia shared our website link. We have a lot of guidance there, as well as what are some of the key items. Felicia talked about independent cost estimate, determining your method of payment, the type of contract that your A&E contract will pertain. And also, does your agency require a consultant in a management support role? There's a process. That process has to be approved by the Federal Highway Administration. And then moving on to the full and open competition, some of the main items from that area is you have to do a public announcement. Making this process fair. If you're sending to 3 firms by email, that's a no-no. It's you got to do a public announcement. Got to make sure that all the conflict of interest, the agency's conflict of interest policy is satisfied. And then moving on to qualification-based selection, and this is the meat of the A&E procurement. Main item is costs cannot be considered. It's everything is based on the competency that's demonstrated, and also the qualifications. And also another important thing is conflict of interest. You want to let the firms compete based on the qualifications that can meet your agency's needs. So now moving on to cost is fair and reasonable. So at this stage, you have selected, you've done your solicitation, you've done your evaluation, and you selected your firm. So some of the items that I will be covering will be cost proposal, negotiations, profit fee, independent office of audits and investigations, who are they, and also and again most frequent errors in the forms and resources that we have available. So for cost proposal, some of the main items that are required is basically identifying what goes into the labor portion, and these are your naming your key individuals, the classifications, also that if they're professional or sub-professional, are they licensed or not licensed, and this could be personnel who's working now in the field or in the office, and also determining the level of effort that will go into this particular contract. How many hours will it take to finish this task? And the cost proposal should be tailored towards the method of payment that your agency have determined that would be best fit for the contract and the agency. So if it's a cost plus fixed fee method of payment, or if it's a specific rate of compensation, typically for on-call contracts, the specific rate of compensation is the method of payment that makes a lot more sense to utilize. If it's project specific, the work is typically known. So for agency utilizing the cost plus fixed fee, the risk there is a lot less on the agency. And other items that are included in the cost proposal are the labor costs, the actual wage, the salary, and also the indirect cost rates. We have the other direct costs. This is the ODCs. This is basically what's covering the travel, per diem, and typically the travel, all travel-related cost rates shall not exceed the California Department of Human Resources per your city, county master agreement. And also, the ODC shouldn't include the tools of the trade. Typically, the tools of the trade are included in your indirect cost pool. So if you see any tools of the trade in the ODC portion, I would definitely question it. And the cost proposal is for both prime and subconsultant. And the cost proposal also includes the profit or fee that your firm will be putting in place. So we have the Exhibit 10H. This is our sample cost proposal that has been developed as guidance. So This one on the screen is the cost plus fixed fee method of payment. Basically, how what Felicia has presented is it has the main elements that's required in a contract. It's basically it's your direct costs, your indirect costs, your fixed fee, your profit, the other direct costs. So those are the items that we're looking for in the cost proposal. So once you selected your firm based on their technical proposal and you've done your evaluation, this is where you can receive your cost proposal. The cost proposal needs to be in a format such as how we suggested in that Exhibit 10H. It needs to be broken down by labor costs in the ODCs, and it's required for both the prime and the subconsultant. And also for every new A&E contract, if it's over $150,000, the agency needs to initiate a contract audit and review process. This process is covered in our LAPM Chapter 10. The section is 10.1.3. Basically, there's exhibits that needs to be filled out and it needs to be submitted to the Caltrans Audits and Investigation. The email is also provided here on this slide. So basically, this is will be the exhibits 10A, 10K, and 10H, and also I'll touch base on this on the next few slides as well. So yeah, so once you get your cost proposal, you're in that contract negotiations with the top ranked firm. Again, this is where that independent cost estimate comes into play. So this is one of the first items that was presented earlier in the presentation. And it is very critical because with that independent cost estimate, this should be the basis of negotiations. So you can understand if that cost is fair and reasonable to the local agency. So determining cost allowability, before you understanding like how do you reach what is cost, what is fair and reasonable, you have to understand the federal cost principles that are in place for an A&E contract. And the governing federal regulation is the 48 Code of CFR 31. Basically, they have three principles that, but typically here I have 5. So basically, all costs that is being incurred would need to be allocable, reasonable, allowable. Basically, for allocable are the charges directly tied to the project? Are the charges for reasonable? Are the charges reasonable? Is this a cost that, considering the circumstance that you're in, is this a price that a prudent person would be willing to pay? And also, if it's allowable, is this cost necessary to make this contract to get the services happen, such as travel? And also, 2 items I wanted to point out is consistency. Are the charges consistent? And also documentations. Is there supporting documentations to verify that these charges are consistent and it's appropriate for the contract? So then also there's an indirect cost rate schedule that's also utilized to support the different types of costs, if it's direct costs or if it's indirect costs. For cost analysis, when breaking down your costs and verifying it, you want to make sure that every element adds up to the total price of your contract. You need to understand the need for each element of the cost. Is it, again, going back to the federal cost principle, is it allocable? Is it reasonable? Is it allowable? And also you want to make sure that the items, the charges, doesn't appear more than once. You want to make sure that if it's something that's if it shows up in the indirect costs, it doesn't show up in the ODC. So the general format should be the same as what the proposal, the Exhibit 10H that we have shown. So ways to document the cost analysis would include the actual costs previously incurred. You can also utilize your most recent cost estimate for the same or similar items or service, or you can do an independent forecast of future costs. So these are the items that you can negotiate. I'll also talk in the next 2 slides, the items that you can't negotiate. So these are the negotiable items. So you select your firm, you got your cost proposal, you've done your analysis on it. So these are the items that you can negotiate with the firm. So this includes your work plan, deliverables and schedules, the hours per task, classifications in the quality level of staff, the cost items, ODCs, the profit fee. I will focus on the profit fee in the next few slides as well, and your labor escalation. So these are the main items. From my experience, typically the one item that stands out the most is the hours per task, because this is directly, based on the rates, the hours per task can determine on how huge or how small that contract size will be. But there's other items that you can negotiate too: the work plan, the deliverable, the schedules. Does the schedule that the firm is proposing, does it meet your schedule as your agency? Also, the staff that the firms are proposing, do you need that level of staff? Do you need more expertise, or do you want, if it's something that maybe you don't need a principal on it? And also your the labor escalation, that's something that can be negotiated as well. And it was shown in some of the examples on what some of the escalation rates are. So the items that are not negotiable is your firm's indirect cost rate. And these are subject to audits review. It's also self-certified by the consultant Exhibit 10K. The consultant ICR is established by the cognizant letter. And then the firm's direct labor is also subject to verification through payroll records, or you can do benchmarking of the consultant's direct salary rates through a reasonableness assessment process that your agency has in place already. So what happens if negotiations comes to a stall, or if it's something that it just can't agree upon? And if both sides determine that, if this is unsuccessful, the agency can terminate the negotiations with the top ranked firm and move on to the second ranked firm, and basically repeating the same steps over as well, meaning requesting that cost proposal, reviewing the cost proposal, do that cost analysis, and being ready to negotiate. So again, if the second ranked firm doesn't work out, then you move on to the down the list. So this slide covers the profit fee negotiations. The items that are required in the CFR to be considered includes the scope of the contract, the size of the contract, the complexity, the degree of risk, how long is your contract, and also how many subconsultants is involved in your contract. So these are the items that are required to be considered in your profit fee negotiations. And also, it's very important that there is no markup. The additional profit on subconsultants work, it's not allowed. You cannot do an additional markup. There's already a profit fee requirement that is set aside for the profit for the firm's fee. So here's an example of a profit fee negotiation calculation. The maximum profit fee is set at 15%. So here we have the factors that I have introduced: your contract amount, the nature of services, period of performance, the utilization of subconsultants, the degree of risk. So on the right column, we have our weights. So this is basically what the relative weights of importance that the agency have decided. And again, this is just an example. For you can change it as you best seem fit. Just remember the max profit fee is at 15%. It cannot exceed 15%. So this is just to continue that example. So basically for the contract dollar amount, if the amount is larger, we would say that's there may be less risk. If there's the nature of service, if it's more of a deliverable based work, we'll tend to say, you know, it would impose a lot more risk on the agency. If for the period of performance, if the contracts are longer, it does tend to carry more risk, potential risk. So we give it a higher value. So, and also for the number of consultants, if there's more sub consultants to manage, maybe the agency have decided that, you know, that the risk has increased. So we increase the rates on that, and also the degree of risk. What level of complexity and sensitivity of the work does the contract have? So if it's more complex, the risks will increase. So here's an example. Given so for an A&E contract to provide preliminary engineering, environmental process, and final engineering and design for a bridge replacement project, we have a contract amount $2 million. The contract duration is for 1.5 years, utilizing subconsultant about 35% of the work. So with the factors that I presented earlier, and also the weights, we have the rates at here shown here. So basically, we do an easy multiplication and adding up the right side of the columns. So here we have about 9.5% for your profit fee for your contract. So I also wanted to introduce the Independent Office of Audits and Investigations. They're separate from Caltrans, but they do the oversight on the financial matters. So the exhibits that are required for their review, and this is mainly on the indirect cost rate, is the exhibit 10A, as I mentioned before, for contract that's our $150,000 and greater, you are required to submit the exhibit 10A and also the 10K. So this is for the indirect cost rate acceptance. So this must be done prior to contract execution. And also once the review is successful on the ICR, the firm is issued an ICR acceptance ID. And also I have provided here is the Audits and Investigations website. Please visit the website, and also in our chapter, LAPM chapter 10, 10.1.3 provides the process and also the resources that I've shown here. So this slide covers the most frequent errors and deficiencies. The two items that Felicia pointed out that were the lowest from our most recent performance review was the cost analysis was being done incorrectly or incomplete. It was mostly incomplete. The cost and fee negotiations, there's no documentations. We have talked with Audits Investigations, and they have informed us that email is acceptable as supporting documentation. So any emails that you have in terms of negotiations, I would say to keep it and store it away so that you could, if in case of any audits come up, you could always have that document available. Missing fiscal provisions and standard agreement, the breakdowns of the ODCs, missing cost proposal for the subconsultants. Cost proposals are required for subconsultants. Inadequate cost proposal format. So again, basically we're looking for the direct costs, the indirect cost rate, the ODCs, the profit fee, unallowable method of payment used. incomplete internal control questionnaire, missing 10Ks. 10Ks is basically the process that's used so that the ICR can be reviewed and accepted. So the forms that we have available on our website is we do have a bottom-up method independent cost estimate example that's available. We also have the cost analysis sample also available on our website. So again, please visit our website. It does have a lot of information that will be very helpful for your local agency. And then to wrap up this A&E overview training, I wanted to close it up with the contract execution. The contract execution is mainly more on the contract management portion and not so much on the procurement, but we do find it's very important as well. So 3 items I wanted to touch base on the contract execution, and that will be the amendments, the form submittals, and also, again, the frequent errors. So for the contract amendments, amendments are required when you're changing the original contract terms. Most commonly is if you're changing the duration, if you're changing the cost, and then sometimes if you're changing the work. But typically, you got to be really careful on the you got to be really careful on when you're adding the work. You got to make sure that the work is within your scope of solicitation. If it's outside, then that's something where you may need to reconsider that this may be a new contract which warrants a new solicitation. For on-call contracts, the amendment is restricted to the work, to the task order that has already been started, and shouldn't include any new work. And also, you shouldn't be amending the contract amount for on-call contracts. And also, you want to amend the contract prior to original contract expiration date. This seems very obvious, but then we get this very frequently where the agency is trying to amend a expired contract. Once that contract is expired, it's no longer valid. So the contract execution, some of the submittals that should be submitted to Caltrans include the A&E Contract Reviewer Checklist. This is our Exhibit 10C. The next slide, I'll talk about the Exhibit 10C as well. The DBE information that Carol presented earlier. Also, send in your executed contract to the district. Also, you should also send your Exhibit 10A and any associated documents to Audits and Investigation. And if your agency is utilizing a consultant in a management support role, fill out and complete the Exhibit 10U so that it can be approved by the Federal Highway Administration. And also, it's also very important that only work performed after the obligation authority, the E76 approval, is eligible for federal and state reimbursement. And so for this slide, again, there's a lack of a consultant contract reviewers checklist. Submit that Exhibit 10C. That is our oversight process. That is how we can determine how we can help your agency on your A&E procurement. And also make sure that the provisions are in your final contract. We do have Exhibit 10R that is guidance. And also make sure that you follow your local agency's appropriate contract approval process. So I have Felicia here, and she will close up the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, John, Carol, and Trina. I would like to do a quick recap since we have decided to do the questions in an actual written format, so that way we can send it out to all participants of all of our trainings. We're going to cut the webinar hopefully within the 2 hours, so that way time is valuable, and we'll send those out so everyone can actually read those. So what we talked about today is we have 5 stages that we feel are very important to procurement. If you can understand these 5 stages and the most important key points in these, we feel that you will do very well in your procurement. So the first stage that we talked about was procurement planning. So first ask yourself, what agreements do you have in place? What are your policy and procedures? What's your conflict of interest? What does your master agreement say? What is your project and what are your needs for a consultant? Make sure you develop a good scope of work. Again, this could be an ongoing document, but you need enough information in your solicitation that everyone can propose on this. You're going to assign your contract administrator. Develop your solicitation, which will include a procurement schedule. This is such as when proposals are due, when you're going to award the contract. You're also going to have your work schedule within that solicitation. In your solicitation, you need to list what type of contract. Is it going to be a project specific or on call? What type of payment method? If it's an on call, how many contracts do you expect to execute? This needs to be listed in the solicitation. Are you expecting 1 or 5? If you have more than 1, how are your task orders going to be issued? Are you going to do an additional qualifications base, or have you separated your areas into regions? You have 2 choices there. Make sure that you send a copy of your contract language and the 10R, Exhibit 10R, Federal Fiscal Provisions. Your consultant wants to know what are the expectations and can they meet them. Let them know right up front. When you go to stage 2, the full and open competition, all public funds must be competitive. They must be competitively bid or proposed. So you're going to advertise publicly for a minimum for A&E contracts, it's 14 days. But as Trina mentioned, don't necessarily stick to the 14 days. Do a 21 day if that's what your region kind of supports. You want to make sure that you have 3 proposals to evaluate. What's your DBE goal? If you're using federal funds, you need to set a DBE goal and you'll have your 10I, your Exhibit 10I in your solicitation. When you go to stage 3, we're looking at qualifications-based selection. Again, another really big item. You should have a responsiveness checklist. If you receive 6 proposals, you need to evaluate 6 proposals unless you have a reason. This responsiveness checklist will be your reasoning. Evaluate on your published criteria. The criteria that you evaluate on must match your evaluation sheets that you have in your file. If there are any changes to that criteria, you need to do an addendum before those come in. Make sure your evaluation criteria has weight so you can properly rank each consultant. If you have on your panel, you need to have 3 or more evaluators. What we suggest, if you have an even number, you could end up with a tie. 1 person is not a panel. You could be challenged on biasness. So make sure that you have at least 3 members. Any person involved in the procurement process needs to sign Exhibit 10T to show there is no conflict of interest, or if there is, what is disclosed. Do not consider price. For an A&E contract, we don't consider price. It's all qualifications-based selection, no matter how big or how small. Your fee should be less than 15%. The CFR says maximum is 15%. If you don't evaluate 3 proposals, look at Chapter 10. It'll tell you what to do. Basically, if you have 2 or less, you're going to write a justification for your file. If you have 1 proposal, you're going to be required to fill out a public interest finding. This will need to be signed by your DLAE in your district to verify that your competition was open and fair. Remember to negotiate and make your records clear on how you negotiated with the top ranked consultant. If you don't have documentation in the file, again, it didn't happen, but this is one of our target areas. Negotiation, you should have documentation. Stage 4, cost is fair and reasonable. Remember to prepare your independent cost estimate. It needs to have the items such as the independent or the indirect cost rate, other direct costs, the fee and the profit, the direct salary and the wage rates and the classifications. Remember to submit your financial review documents to our audits and investigations. That would be Exhibit 10A, which includes the 10K that'll come from your consultants. You'll want to analyze your cost, do your cost analysis. This is an item that is rarely done by agencies. You're going to use your cost proposal and your independent cost estimate. You're going to compare the differences in cost and make sure that you can document that your cost is reasonable. Be sure to apply the federal cost principle, C2 CFR 200, and what that entails. Stage 5 is execution. If you have cost proposals that were unopened, remember to return those sealed in their envelopes. You're not allowed to look at those and compare prices. Make sure your federal provisions, the Exhibit 10R, is in your contract. Document, 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 and practice good contract administration when you do your contract. See Chapter 10 of the LAPM for the list of the exhibits that you'll use throughout the procurement process. These are all listed in there. As John mentioned, if you're going to do an amendment, please be sure that your contract is not expired when you go to amend it. So amend your contracts prior to the execution or the expiration date. Keep on-call contracts to within the original contract amount and within 5 years. If you have your ICR that changes on a contract, that needs to go through our audits and investigations. Also, if your contract exceeds $150,000 and you didn't go through our audits and investigations in the beginning, you will need to send your documentation so they can review the ICR on that. The scope of work changes, again, must be within the original solicitation. And all A&E contracts follow the qualifications-based selection. There is no cost allowance in any of the A&E contracts. So no matter how big or small, it follows the qualifications-based selection. And last but not least, follow the Exhibit 10C process that's listed in our LAPM for A&E contracts. The districts will check this to make sure it's submitted in order to pay your invoice. This is part of our risk-based oversight responsibilities. And as mentioned in the beginning, we will address the questions submitted in the chat box to all our training personnel that have attended. I'd like to thank Sac State for conducting this webinar, and thank you so much, participants, for joining us today.